Remember those endless summer days that felt like they just last forever? Sun rays kiss your skin. Grass tickles your toes as you bite into the creamy popsicle melting in your hand. Pure, unbothered bliss. Capture more sun-drenched memories with the Orange Vanilla Dream Hydration Multiplier from Liquid IV. This nostalgic vanilla flavor with notes of candied orange can help keep you hydrated while savoring your favorite golden hour moments. No matter how hot your summer gets, just one stick of Liquid IV and 16 ounces of water hydrates you better than water alone. It's 3 times the electrolytes of the leading sports drink, with 8 vitamins and nutrients for refreshing on-the-go hydration. Live your summer dream with Liquid IV. Tear, pour, live more. Go to liquidiv.com and get 20% off your first order with code INDULGE20 at checkout. That's code INDULGE20 at liquidiv.com.
On my most recent visit to the Somme battlefield in eastern France, I visited a cemetery known as the Devonshire Cemetery that overlooks part of the July 1st battlefield, and there I read the words of a young British lieutenant named William Noel Hodgson, who was coming to grips with his own emotions and his own feelings about mortality as he looked over the battlefield that he would have to lead his men through on July 1st, 1916. And it really struck my heart in a pretty significant way. I did a video on it for my YouTube channel, and because I was so impacted by it, I went and bought the book entitled Before Action, which is the story of William Noel Hodgson, and it's based on that poem that I read at his gravesite. So I wanted to take some time to share with you some of what I've learned about this young man, his story, his writing, and why it is in general that just so many of these young men who went to the Western Front ended up using their gift of the language to find a way to express what they were feeling and thinking and experiencing in one of the most horrific chapters of human history. For this particular young man, war was never really a part of his plans. He grew up in an educated, devout Christian family. His father was an Anglican bishop, and he excelled at nearly everything in school. He was a brilliant student and athlete. He went to Durham School and went on to Oxford University, earned top honors in his class. But his real passion was writing. In fact, his friends knew him as a cheerful, outgoing young man that they would nickname Smiler because of his constant grin. Had the world remained at peace, we might have known Noel Hodgson as a scholar or an author leading a long, quiet life. But history had other plans. When World War I broke out in 1914, Hodgson, like so many of his generation, volunteered for the army. He was commissioned as an officer in the 9th Battalion of the Devonshire Regiment, and he shipped out to France in 1915. There, this gentle poet quickly proved his bravery. During the Battle of Loos in September 1915, he led his men in capturing an enemy trench and held it under heavy fire for 36 hours without relief. For that, he would be mentioned in dispatches and awarded the Military Cross for courage. He'd only been in the trenches a short time, but he'd already seen and done more than most could imagine. After Loos, he enjoyed a brief respite in England before returning to the front lines in 1916, just in time for the Somme offensive. And through all of that, Noel Hodgson never stopped writing. He had been crafting poems and stories since his school days, and even amidst the war, he continued to write whenever he could. In early 1916, he published several of his pieces in magazines under the pen name Edward Melbourne, hiding his real identity. At first, his poetry echoed the optimistic, patriotic style of the pre-war era. He was very much a Georgian poet in the mold of Rupert Brooke. But as the reality of trench warfare began to set in, his verses, like many men's writings, grew more solemn and introspective, grappling with the fears and sacrifices that he and his men would face. By late June 1916, on the eve of the attack at the Somme, Hodgson's writing took a profoundly poignant turn. Stationed with his unit near Mametz, waiting to go over the top, He put pen to paper one last time. The result was Before Action, the poem that I mentioned at the start. In that poem, Hodgson offered a kind of prayer, asking for strength and ultimately the courage to face even death, with lines like, "By all the lights that I shall miss, help me to die, O Lord." It's a heartrending reflection of a young man coming to terms with his own mortality. Many of the people who read it feel that Hodgson sensed what was coming, and indeed, 2 days after it was published, he was killed, leading his men into battle. And so in this episode, we'll journey through William Noel Hodgson's story, a personal and poignant journey from his early life and education to the mud and terror of the Western Front, to the evolution of his poetry under fire, and finally to the creation of what I believe is his most significant and heartbreaking work, Before Action, on the Brink of Battle. Along the way, we'll see how an Oxford-educated idealist transformed into a soldier poet, chronicling the harsh truths of warfare. It's a story of youth, courage, and creativity forged in the crucible of conflict. By the end of our time together, we'll not only understand what happened to this young man, but also feel the emotional depth of the words he left behind. Words that still speak to us in that humble prayer for strength across the years. When I picture William Noel Hodgson before the war, I see a tall, broad-shouldered teenager with a permanent grin, so much so that his classmates at Durham School simply called him Smiler. He was born on the 3rd of January 1893 in Thornbury, Gloucestershire, the youngest of 4 children of Reverend Henry Bernard Hodgson, a vicar who would later become the first bishop of St. Edmundsbury and Ipswich. When Noel was still a toddler, the family moved back to Berwick-upon-Tweed, where the North Sea wind rattled the church windows and a boy could roam the riverbanks, dreaming big dreams. At the age of 12, he earned a King's Scholarship to Durham School, a prestigious boarding school perched high above the River Wear. He arrived in September 1905 and, true to form, threw himself at everything. He steered the second rowing crew in 1907, played in the cricket 11 in 1910 and 1911, laced up for rugby 15, and twice won the school steeplechase cross-country race in 1909 and again in 1911. I ran track and cross-country in college. I never did the steeplechase. It just seemed like a great way to end up doing a face plant into a tub of water. So I never did it, but it looked really hard. So I can just picture that in my mind from my own experiences. All those miles pounded out on the muddy cross-country course hint at the stubborn endurance that we'll see later in the trenches. Yet even then, Noel was more than a sportsman. He loved Greek and Latin, recited poetry at morning assembly, and scribbled verses of his own in the margins of exercise books. Early attempts that blended schoolboy bravado with flashes of genuine lyric skill. By the summer of 1911, he and a close friend, Noel Oxland, who would also become a war poet, left Durham together, bound for Christ Church, Oxford. Noel had won an exhibition, a kind of partial scholarship, to read classics, and in March 1913, he took first in classical moderations, the top honor in his year. Oxford suited him perfectly. Tutorial rooms stacked with ancient texts by day, crisp rowing outings at dawn, informal debates in smoky college rooms at night. And of course, the writing continued. One early poem that he wrote, called Rome is No More, reveals a young man already fascinated by the rise and fall of civilizations. Another notebook shows sketches for short stories set in the Tyne Valley of his boyhood. Oxford friends thought he might become an academic or maybe a novelist. Nobody expected the Military Cross winner he would soon become. Looking back, I find it remarkable how seamlessly his talents aligned for what lay ahead in his life. The discipline of sport, the mental stamina of a classical study, the moral grounding of a clergyman's household, and a bright, empathetic spirit. Those threads wove together into the officer poet who would later steady his platoon under shell fire and then stay up late to capture the day's terror in verse. But in the autumn of 1913, the coming war was still only a rumor on the horizon. Noel Hodgson planned to stay up at Oxford for Greats, the final 2-year stretch of ancient philosophy and history. Had history taken a different turn, he might have become a lecturer on ancient civilizations, scribbling poems on the side. But the guns of August 1914 were about to rewrite his storyline, and William Noel Hodgson's classical ideals would soon clash with the brutal modernity of the Western Front. The summer of 1914 cracked open like a starter's pistol. All across Britain, the recruiting posters went up, the bands struck an optimistic tune, and young men poured into drill halls convinced the adventure would be over by Christmas. I picture Noel Hodgson, still the ever-smiling Oxford scholar, standing in one of those queues, his commission application tucked under one arm, eagerness written across his face. He wasn't alone in feeling that surge of patriotic electricity. In an early wartime poem, England to Her Sons, he writes, "Sons of mine, I hear you thrilling to the trumpet call of war." It's pure 1914 optimism, uplifting, almost jubilant. But those lines also mark the exact moment the poet stepped onto a very different life path. On August 6, 1914, 2 days after Britain declared war, Hodgson volunteered for the army. A month later, on September 18th, he was gazetted as a second lieutenant in the newly raised 9th Service Battalion of the Devonshire Regiment. His friends still called him Smiler, but the uniform added a sudden weight to that grin. For the next 12 months, the 9th Devons drilled on English soil. Imagine it, miles of route marching over the South Downs, bayonet practice on straw sacks, nights in damp bell tents that smelled of bootblack and bully beef. Hodgson's official dossier simply says, "Training in England for the first year of the war." But between those lines, you can almost hear the shouted cadence of left, right, left, and feel the mix of boredom but bright-eyed anticipation that every new officer carried. Even in uniform, Noel kept writing. Letters home were sprinkled with classical references and dry humor. Notebooks filled up with the rough drafts of poems like one that he simply titled The Call, where the Arcadian daydreams meet a very modern battlefield. To his family, he confessed that he missed Oxford's libraries. But he also admitted he, quote, would not for worlds be anywhere but here, now, end quote. That sentence alone shows how completely 1914's patriotic tide swept him along. Of course, none of these eager recruits could foresee the mud, wire, and industrial violence waiting across the channel. But Hodgson was determined to be ready. By the spring of 1915, his platoon could strip a rifle blindfolded, build a sandbag parapet in the dark, and march 20 miles without complaint. The poet had become, in every practical sense, a professional soldier. At last, in late July 1915, orders came through. The 9th Devons would sail for France. Noel scribbled one last verse in England, folded it into his pay book, and shouldered his kit bag. The waiting was over. The real war was about to begin. On July 28, 1915, the 9th Devons disembarked at Le Havre, and they were quickly shuttled north to the rain-slick trenches near Festubert, a patchwork of mud walls, duckboards, and rusting wire that would be their home for the next 2 months. Life there was equal parts boredom and foreboding. Days passed in a rhythmic loop. Stand to at dawn, repair the parapet, swap jokes over cold tea, duck when the German whiz-bangs came over, then write a letter home before night patrol. It was nothing like the gallant war of the recruiting posters, and Noel Hodgson's notebook entries, thin, hurried lines between sentry shifts, hint that reality was beginning to rub the gilt off the patriotic picture he had carried from Oxford. Then came September 25th, 1915, the Battle of Loos. The Devons were ordered to seize a German trench near the mining village of Loos en Gohel. At dawn, a cloud of chlorine gas drifted across no man's land. The assault whistles shrilled, and Hodgson scrambled up the scaling ladder with 3 other young officers and roughly 100 men at his heels. They stormed the enemy line, grenades cracking in the gloom, and astonishingly took the position. But the cost was immediate. Water bottles were punctured, ammunition ran low, and German counterattacks began within the hour. For the next 36 hours, Noel Hodgson and his little band held that captured trench without food, water, or reinforcements, under relentless machine gun and mortar fire. At one point, they resorted to scooping rainwater from shell holes. At another, Hodgson personally crawled along the battered parapet to steady a wavering section. For this feat, he was mentioned in dispatches and later awarded the Military Cross, an extraordinary decoration for a man barely 22 years old. Those who survived called the captured line a hellhole, and when the battalion finally staggered out, caked in mud and cordite, Noel Hodgson, ever the poet, reached for his notebook. Out of that nightmare came a remarkable poem, Back to Rest. Listen to the opening lines. A leaping wind from England, the skies without a stain, clean cut against the morning, slim poplars after rain. After the grime of battle, we know that these are good. But then a few stanzas later, the raw truth. Death whining down from heaven, death roaring from the ground. Doubting, we charged and conquered. Hopeless, we struck and stood. Notice how the lines swing between gentle images of English countryside and the choking reality of high-explosive shells. It's a bridge between two worlds, the peaceful landscape that shaped Hodgson's imagination, and then the battlefield now reshaping it. He wasn't writing patriotic exhortations anymore. He was writing a testimony. A few weeks later, the citation for his Military Cross came through, and with it a promotion to lieutenant. The War Office granted him shore leave in England, just long enough to show his medal to his proud parents and try unsuccessfully to explain what Loos had really looked like, smelled, and sounded like. Friends back at Oxford were startled by the newly steely edge and their easygoing smiler. He still cracked jokes at dinner, but there were sudden silences too. Moments when his gaze drifted somewhere far beyond the candlelight. When his leave ended, Noel Hodgson returned to France with something new flickering behind the eyes. Experience. He had shown himself a fine line officer under fire, and now he was also a writer whose pen refused to look away from war's jagged face. The discipline of the trenches, the strain of that 36-hour stand, and the relief embodied in Back to Rest would shape every poem he wrote thereafter. When the winter of 1915 turned into the raw, gray spring of 1916, Noel Hodgson and the 9th Devons found themselves in France near Fricourt. But by April, they had edged a little further south to a shallow, newly scraped line opposite the ruined village of Mametz. The men christened the position Mansell Copse after the thin stand of trees that sheltered the trench from the western wind. On paper, these parts of the war were quiet. In practice, what that meant was steady sniper fire, the occasional trench mortar bomb, and an endless to-do list. Wiring parties after midnight, repairs to the parapets at dawn, fatiguing walks up a duckboard communication trench to fetch rations that always seemed to run short. The battalion had time to breathe, but also time to think, which can be dangerous at the front. For Noel Hodgson, thinking meant writing. By now he'd discovered a handy trick. Publish under a pen name so the War Office censors Perhaps even the folks at home wouldn't fret about a serving officer's candor. Early that year, his writing began appearing in The New Witness and other magazines under the byline Edward Melbourne. The pieces were a revelation. Gone was the rousing thub-thump tone of 1914. Instead, Hodgson served up wry, almost conversational portraits of trench life. My favorites are the short stories starring his Batman, a resourceful private who could brew tea in a shell hole, barter for fresh bread with the French locals, and somehow keep a lieutenant's kit clean even after a week of rain. They read like affectionate miniature comedies, and they remind me that a war is not all about heroics. It's also the little domestic triumphs that make the next stand bearable. Of course, his humor was laced with fatigue. When Hodgson wrote a poem now, the imagery tilted toward dusk rather than dawn. He still loved his pastoral England, the larks, the poplars, the clean horizons, but the lines were shadowed by the memory of Loos and the uneasy silence before whatever came next. I sometimes picture him hunched over a mess tin desk in a dugout, a candle lighting as he pauses mid-sentence to listen for the distant thud of the big guns. The French called the sound le coup de canon. Hodgson called it a reminder. Away from the page, the battalion drilled relentlessly. Bombing practice in a disused chalk quarry. Map exercises in a barn. Rehearsals for an attack nobody yet dared name. We'd later learn it was all for something called the Somme offensive. But in March or April of 1916, it just felt like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. What strikes me looking back is how discipline and imagination coexisted in Noel Hodgson. By day, he would drill his men on the proper overarm swing of a Mills bomb. By night, he crafted poems that asked hard questions about fear, faith, and duty. That twin life sharpened his writing. Each humdrum trench detail, mud-clogged boots, a broken rum jar, the way the moon glinted on barbed wire. Each of these things became fuel for a stanza. And the men noticed, too. One sergeant later recalled that when Mr. Hodgson read a fresh sketch aloud, the dugout fell silent. Pipes went out. Even the rats seemed to pause. Hearing their own world set down in clear, honest language gave the platoon a kind of reflected courage. If the lieutenant can name it, perhaps the rest of us can face it. By mid-June 1916, the pre-battle bombardment had begun, a rolling thunder that shook the chalk from the trench walls and made conversation impossible. Hodgson kept writing anyway, scribbling lines on field message pads between duty turns. The lighter stories dried up, the poems darkened, as though each shell burst blotted another patch of daylight from his mind's eye. All of that tension, all of that waiting would soon crystallize in a single prayer poem titled Before Action. But we're not quite there yet. For now, I want to leave you with a simple image, a young officer still nicknamed Smiler, though his grin has thinned somewhat, sitting on an ammunition box at Mansell Copse. His Batman fusses with the Primus stove. The company runner dozes by the fire step. Overhead, the guns rumble like distant thunder. Noel Hodgson dips his pen, scratches out a few more lines, then looks up at the darkening sky. He doesn't know it yet, but the poem taking shape will be the last one he ever writes. It's now late June 1916. Noel Hodgson is crouched in a shallow dugout at Mansell Copse, pencil stub in one hand, a battered notebook in the other. Outside, the sky pulses white every few seconds. The British guns have begun pounding the German lines, and the chalk dust hangs in the air like fog. In a few days, they'll go over the top. Nobody says it aloud, but every man feels the clock ticking. Lieutenant Noel Hodgson feels it most of all. He's sitting on an ammunition box, shoulders hunched, writing by the flutter of a candle. He pauses, looks up at the ragged treetops, then bends to the page again. What he's drafting tonight is not an order, not a letter home, but a poem, a final reckoning with everything he's seen and everything he fears. By all the glories of the day, and the cool evening's benison, by that last sunset touch that lay upon the hills when the day was done, by beauty lavishly outpoured, and blessings carelessly received, by all the days that I have lived, make me a soldier, Lord. By all of man's hopes and fears, and all the wonder poets sing, the laughter of unclouded years, and every sad and lovely thing, by the romantic ages stored, with high endeavor that was his, by all his mad catastrophes, make me a man, O Lord. I, that on my unfamiliar hill saw with uncomprehending eyes 100 of thy sunsets spill their fresh and sanguine sacrifice ere the sun swings his noonday sword, must say goodbye to all of this, by all delights that I shall miss. Help me to die, O Lord. I'm sure you can hear the emotion in my voice, and it was the same exact feeling I had when I crouched in Noel Hodgson's grave and read that poem for the very first time. He doesn't say, help me win, or help me survive. Just help me face it. Help me face what I know is coming. Help me face what all my experience in life has led up to in this moment. For a 23-year-old, that is an unimaginable amount of clarity. He turns his poem into a prayer, honest, unembellished, and reading it now, it's heart-stoppingly prophetic. The poem was published in England on June 29th, 1916, in the New Witness. It was a weekly paper back home. It was 2 days before Noel Hodgson climbed the scaling ladder on the first morning of the Battle of the Somme. Friends who opened the paper on Saturday found themselves holding a soldier's farewell in their hands, even as that soldier was already marching toward his death. What strikes me is how the form echoes an evening hymn, 3 8-line stanzas, each closing couplet a distilled plea. Make me a soldier. Make me a man. Help me to die. Critics later called it one of the purest expressions of stoic courage to come out of the war. But Hodgson didn't write it for critics. He wrote it for himself and perhaps for the men around him who were too busy checking grenades to pick up a pen. Outside his dugout, the guns keep up their monotonous thunder. Noel Hodgson signs his name, folds the sheet, and hands it to the company runner who will slip it into the outgoing mailbag. Then he blows out the candle, shoulders his rifle, and steps onto the fire step to check the line one more time before dawn. Saturday morning, July 1st, 1916. At 7:30 a.m., the signal blasts along the line, and the first wave of the 9th Devons scramble over the parapet at Mansell Copse, heading for the German trenches on the rise beyond Mametz. Lieutenant William Noel Hodgson is acting as the battalion bombing officer for the morning. His haversack is stuffed with Mills grenades, his grin replaced by a look of fierce concentration. The bombardment that was supposed to smash the enemy has left plenty of their machine guns intact. Almost at once, a weapon hidden beside a small roadside shrine opens up, stitching bullets across the chalk. Hodgson darts forward, determined to resupply the men who have already reached the first lip of trench. A single round catches him in the neck. He's dead before he hits the ground. His faithful servant, his Batman, falls a moment later, and is found lying beside him when the firing slackens that evening. Across the copse, the toll is appalling. By nightfall, more than 160 men of the 9th Devons lie dead or dying. Later records put the joint burial of the 8th and 9th Battalions at 159 bodies interred in a single trench. Yet even among the chaos, comrades take care of their lieutenant. They carry his body back to the very front-line trench the Devons had occupied at dawn and lay him in the chalk wall alongside the others. 2 days later, that trench is closed over, turf pressed flat above the rows of hastily placed wooden crosses. Over them, the survivors erect a board and a sign that still reads, "The Devonshires held this trench. The Devonshires hold it still." That trench grave later becomes the Devonshire Cemetery. Noel Hodgson rests there today, row A, grave 3, a few paces from the place where he fell. It's one of the most powerful places I've ever stood in my life, standing at his grave, knowing it was the trench where he wrote those words, looking out over the valley where he gave his life for king and country. A place where he asked for courage to face the moment. And then that split second between sprint and impact, he met it head on. No fanfare, no last words, just duty done. A few weeks after the opening of the Somme offensive, a telegram reached the Hodgson family. Lieutenant William Noel Hodgson killed in action, 1st July. There was no mention of heroics, no space to quote his poem, just those stark words. Back in Berwick upon Tweed in Oxford, friends opened the New Witness and realized that the farewell published on the 29th of June had been prophetic. The trench where the poet had written those words had become his final resting place. Within a year of his death, Noel's father gathered the poems and sketches he'd sent home and arranged for the title Verse and Prose in Peace and War to be published in London. The first edition sold out so quickly that a second edition appeared soon after, ensuring that Noel Hodgson's voice reached far beyond the circle of family and school friends. The slim green volume bore a tissue-guarded portrait of a smiling young officer in service dress, proof that the nickname Smiler hadn't been entirely extinguished by war. Literary circles soon recognized his significance. The War Poets Association notes that Hodgson is probably best remembered today for his poem Before Action, a threefold prayer for courage that has become inseparable from the story of the Somme. It turns up again and again in anthologies, memorial services, and classroom discussions of First World War literature. A full-length biography, tellingly titled Before Action, A Poet on the Western Front, was published almost a century later, and it was that book that led me to create this podcast today. I knew his story only by that single poem when I stood at his grave a few years ago on the Somme, but I couldn't help but want to know more. And now whenever I walk the Somme battlefields, as I will again in just a few weeks, I take time to pause at the Devonshire Cemetery. A friend of mine, his name's Sean, is a British veteran himself, and he's from Devonshire, and he's got a special connection to those men that can't help but rub off on me just a little bit. Larks still rise over the wheat fields there, just as Hodgson described. And in the hush, you can almost hear the closing line of his poem, "Help me to die, O Lord." But I'm always struck by a different truth. In giving us that prayer, Noel Hodgson helped us remember how to live courageously, honestly, and with our eyes wide open to both the beauty and terror of this world. Thank you for joining me on the journey through William Noel Hodgson's short but brilliant life. If his words moved you Seek out that 1917 collection of his poems, or visit the Devonshire plot one quiet afternoon. Let the larks and the silence fill the spaces between his lines. Until next time, I'm Chris Mowery, and this has been Stories of the Great War. Thanks for listening.